This is going to be a quick video just showcasing all you really would need to know about the hair simulations. And there's going to be a few different steps to this, so hang in there. I'm going to go through how to apply a hair simulation to an object, how you can transform that into other things, and then I'm going to show you how to render it. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is I'm going to remove the cube, and I'm going to use a sphere for the hair demo. So I'm just going to go to Add, Mesh, and I'll use a UV sphere. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to remesh this to make it a little less regular, because the faces and how the faces are constructed will matter quite a lot for the hair. And that's because the hair will oftentimes be coming from these vertices. And so the distribution of the vertices will make a big difference. So if I, for example, X out, it will have a very uniform distribution, but if I remesh and just apply that, now it's going to be a little bit less regular. Well, that's just the initial setup, and of course you could do a hair simulation on any object and just see what happens, and I actually recommend trying that occasionally. But all we really need to do to get the hair simulation started is to run over here to the Particle Properties tab. And when you're in the Particles Property tab, you can just click a plus to add a particle system slot. But this is going to be specifically a hair system, so instead of using an emitter, we want to click hair. Immediately you see how that populates the object, and it is evenly distributed still around the entire sphere. Before I show you how to contain it, I'm just going to go through some of the different properties that are quite useful. And most of them are right here at the top. They're pretty straightforward. Stuff like the hair length. If we shorten it, it will shorten. Segments is akin to the resolution. The more segments, the heavier it will be in your computer, and the smoother it will be when it curves. Currently, none of this hair is curving. It's all straight out. But that will change rather quickly once we get into it, and this will, if you increase the segments, it will allow it to be more curvy. There are a lot of tabs here, and we don't really need to go through all of them, but a few of them that are quite important are the hair dynamics, the render, the viewport display, and then stuff like the hair shape and field weights in children. So really all these first ones are the most interesting for us. Hair dynamics and the force and field weight settings all go hand in hand, as they're a bit separated here on the list, but the hair dynamics essentially just tells the hair to respond to the forces and the fields in the scene. So if I check on hair dynamics, this again has some more simulation and quality settings. The default is probably okay. And then it has a cache location, and you don't need to cache things right away, but a cache is basically a saving of a simulation. And before we even get into that, once I have hair dynamics checked on, we can just hit the play button on the timeline and you'll see exactly what happens. And this is already creating a bit of an animation for us. I'll go ahead and just pause it. It's kind of stopped flopping about, but you can see here these hairs look like they are straight segments, and that comes into the number of segments directly. So if I increase the number of segments, you see it's kind of messing up the simulation, but it is going to make them able to bend more. It will also take a bit longer for the computer to simulate the run. Now I'm going to leave that actually back at 5. And you'll see that as I was making changes to the settings, it kind of gunked up the simulation. Whenever you get a simulation kind of gunked, you just need to reset it. And I'm actually just, in the default layout, there's this timeline, this very handy timeline window that's pulled in. And this gives you all of the kind of animation controls. So if you kind of back to the beginning, you can hit play, you can hit reverse play, and then you can jump to the end or the beginning. If you bake a simulation, though, it essentially locks in the simulation, which means that when you hit the play button, the computer doesn't have to recompute anything. It will have saved it to a location on your computer. And this is going to be really handy once you have more complicated scenes, or you don't want the simulation to be running uniquely each time. You just kind of want to keep it in place so that you can work on other things. This will also be quite handy if you want to use these for geometry generation rather than just rendering. And I'll just go ahead and bake this simulation out. Alright, it is baked, and now you'll just watch it can run very smoothly, very quickly. I have the Eevee renderer currently on, but now that we have it simulated, you could even just watch it play in Eevee. It's kind of hypnotic. You know, Eevee doesn't have the greatest shadows, so of course if we swap over to cycles, it will clean it up. This also is a great segue in. You'll notice that the hair looks different when you swap into cycles. And that's because there are some hair settings that we can tweak. So I'm actually just going to really quickly change my background color, get a little more contrast in the scene, and I'm going to go ahead and add 2 material slots to this object. One will be for the base object itself, and one will be for the hair. I'm going to, in the first slot, for the main body of the object, I'm just going to use our favorite, the simplest kind of material, a diffuse BSDF, and then for this one, I will turn it into a hair BSDF. But we'll get into that after a bit. For now, this material isn't even associated with the hair directly. So if we go into the particle settings, which again are always going to be located on this little particle properties tab, we can make our way to the render, and we can also go to viewport display and children and shape. So these 4 are the hair render controls, and similar to the segments, the path steps will also increase the resolution when you go to render. So and if we do it in the viewport, you'll see it instantly kind of smoothing it. And this is great, but again, the higher these numbers get, the more computation, the more difficult it is for your computer to do that. So just be careful with that. A really handy feature, though, you'll see this tab, Children, is quite simple. It's only got 3 options, at least initially. And if I click one of them, what it's going to do is it is going to populate hair in between hair. Essentially, it's not going to simulate these, it's going to approximate them. But this is a great way to amp up the density without having to raise this number of strands to a really high level. So if I just click Simple, you'll see it has interpolated here 10 hairs per hair. So it has multiplied it by a factor of 10, which gives it an amazing density, which is one of those things you really need when you are simulating hair for it to look correct. And you'll see that in the display it's doing 10, in the render it's going to render 100 times more. And that's it's much better to do this than to change the number of particles to be higher. It's important to know, though, this is only in rendering. The children are not actually in the scene. They are an illusion. They are not actual objects. If I go to interpolated, it changes the distribution a bit. It has a bit more nuance to how it's distributed, but you can just try one or the other. For now, though, I'm going to leave the children off because I'm going to look at the hair shape. And this is really drastic, what it will do. So if I slide these bars, you'll see that you can thicken and thin the hair. This is the diameter at the base, and this is the diameter at the tip. And then the diameter scale, of course, will affect the whole thing. So if I set it back to what it was initially or close to that. If I go put a 0 here, it will thin it down drastically. And for a lot of hair, you want it to be quite thin. So once I have perhaps the hair shaped what I want, then I can start playing around with the children. You'll see now it's very wispy hair. Very, very different from what we started with. But again, this is mostly for the rendering setup. And if we wanted to, imagine we're happy with this, we could set up a camera, turn on simple, and hit render. And I'll actually just go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to position a camera. I'm going to go to view, camera to view, and get the camera here. I'll hit render. I haven't adjusted any of the sample settings or anything like that, but you'll see it's going to take a bit of time. It's going to take much longer than a render of just a sphere, for example, because if you remember, in the render amount, it is putting 100 children per hair, so it has 100 times the amount of work to do. But look how soft that is. It's amazing how that can break up the light very, very romantically. Now, you could use hair for a number of things. It's amazing for grass, it's amazing for plants, it's amazing for all sorts of kind of rendered effects in a scene. But I'm actually going to stop this render now because there are some other good uses for it as well. And one of the things I like about it is to actually just generate some initial form to work on. And before I get into that, I'm actually going to quickly show you how to contain the hair to a specific sub-region on the object. So I'm going to delete the cache, so I'm going to free the simulation, and I'm going to click on my original sphere and go into edit mode. Here I can see all of the points on the sphere, and I'm going to, with point select on, I'm just going to select some points, and I'll even turn on X-ray mode and lock here to the top so that I can cleanly select a kind of uniform rectangle. So I have, you see this kind of ring I just selected. I'm going to here under the vertex tab go to vertex groups, and I'm going to assign these vertices to a group. So now nothing has changed in the appearance, but these have a group. In the hair simulation settings, there is a vertex groups sub tab, and there are a number of these you can play around with if you make a variety of different types of groups. I've only made the one, and it's to demonstrate how to contain. So I've now put the entire density of the hairs into this vertex group, and you'll see exactly what that has done for us. Before I get into turning these into a mesh, I'm going to rather quickly show the hair material. So you see this is what this looks like. I'm going to thicken those hairs up a bit, or a lot. You see they're just like little toothpicks, and I'm going to do that because I want the hair to now take on this hair material that I created. And so to do that, you have this render tab, and it will give you a slot for the material. And if we look at our object, the second material 002 is our hair material, so I just need to plug that in here to this material. And now when I look at it, it may not be totally obvious at first, but this is much more translucent. And I'll even go into the shader editor for material 2, and so here is the hair BSDF, and I can, let's see, change the color for that. I can see it's applying to the original object as well, so I need to make sure that is staying as material 1. This is a great way to add some nuance to a model. Now if I keep playing with these settings, I can make it very fluffy and soft, right, by decreasing the diameter, turning on some children, and that's starting to look pretty good. The final thing on the rendering I'm going to show you, and actually it'll be a good segue into turning it into a proper mesh geometry, are the comb tools. So what you can do once you have a hair simulation added to an object is you have a new mode available, which is called the particle edit mode. And this actually just gives you a little brush, and you can twist and position the hair however you want. You can comb your model, and you'll see I'm giving my sphere a nice little mohawk here. That looks pretty good. So of course you could simulate with forces in the scene some version. Let's change the light. Let's amp the lighting a little bit here. But you'll see how flowy that can become rather quickly. So you can play around with the hair, have a good old time with that. Of course, I would probably want to smooth this cube out, or this sphere out. I wouldn't want to see these polygons probably. But one thing I am going to do now is you'll see that here's where we've been with all of the hair and hair particle settings. There is this additional thing that you can manipulate, which actually is a modifier that has been added to the mesh. Now if I convert this to a mesh, I have now converted those hairs into a mesh, and they are overlapping currently with the hair simulation, but I can like separate them now from that. And if we were to look in the scene, the thing is that you notice these don't have a thickness to them. There's no actual mesh there. So these can be quite handy, but you need to figure out how to use them in a way. And there are a couple of things you can do. So as a mesh, you could add a skin modifier, but there are a lot of hairs here, and so that will probably crash your machine. So the better thing to do is to right click and convert it to a curve. When you convert it to a curve, it will open up this special curve properties data tab. And what that allows us to do is go into the geometry tab, and we can, through this, give the curves some thickness, and specifically through the depth tool. So if I type in a 0.1, you'll see how I have now thickened that up, but they're all hollow, so what I actually would need to do too would be to fill the caps. So that's a very thick hair, and if I go to render mode now, you'll see that they are in fact three-dimensional based off of that hair's layout. But you can, before you get to that, you can do things like taper them or etc. So I'll actually really quickly show you how to taper these rather quickly. So to do so, the easiest way is to actually use another curve. So I'm going to add a curve, a Bezier curve here to the scene. And how this is going to work is I'm going to sample from this line for the taper. So I'm going to immediately do that by selecting my curve here, which is the hair blob, and in the geometry tab I'm going to select this Bezier curve as the taper object. And you'll see it has immediately tapered them, right? But how that is working is the hair, each strand, takes the distance of the curve from the x-axis as its thickness. So if I edit this curve and I pull these ends and edges, it will change the tapering for all of these in question. And if I, for example, pull this vertically up, I have now thickened the end taper for all of them. You don't want to go below the line probably, because that will make it inside out. But what you might do, if you want them to start thick and thin out, you can have it thicker by pulling it farther and then having it thin by pushing it closer. However you want to do that, it's up to you, of course. But once we have, this is a big mess, and so it would be difficult to use. You could probably play with the resolution a bit, and that'll smooth out the different segments, but there are a lot of segments here, so I want to be very careful with that. And I'm actually going to now manipulate it by converting it back to a mesh, right? So we converted it from a hair particle to a mesh to a curve, and now I'm going to convert it back to a mesh. And that's only because specific tool sets are only available when the object is in a particular type. Now that it's a mesh, the best thing we can probably do for it is remesh it, and that will merge all of these together. So I'm going to do that. And the smaller you make this voxel scale, the closer to that form it will be. So this is a fantastic way, you can see now, to even start a gray boxing process for sculpting, or for rendering. You can get some really interesting kind of finalizing geometry. The closer you push this, you'll see it will start to break some, but you could fix a lot of that in sculpting or beyond. But that's really what I was going to show you with the hair simulations. So I know it was a lot, but really it was just covering how to do the rendering appearance or how to make physical objects out of it. So I hope you find that interesting and enjoyable, and maybe you'll pick to use some of these in your work moving forward. Thanks.